He beheaded 2 of his wives, broke ties with the Pope, created an entirely new religion just to produce a single heir. But that was merely the tip of the iceberg named Henry VIII, the most infamous king in England's history. A man once praised for his majestic appearance and artistic talent would end his days reeking of decay, trapped in the rotting prison of his still-living body.
He is the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. So he is declared Duke of York as a child, and he's always intended to be a great nobleman, but of course isn't raised to become king.
Henry VIII was not just a tyrant. He was a living paradox, devout yet merciless, a dog lover who killed his closest friends, a man who wrote tender love letters, then signed execution orders for the very women he swore to love forever. You think you know Henry VIII? You might want to think again after watching this video. Today, we're pulling back the veil of history not to retell what the textbooks already say, but to uncover the grotesque, the bizarre, and the haunting truths about a man who left one of the deepest scars on England's royal bloodstream. Brace yourself. This is not just the story of a king, it's the story of power, decay, and the ultimate price of chasing immortality in the pages of history. In the Tudor court of 16th century England, no one was closer to the king than the groom of the stool, the man in charge of Henry VIII's royal bowel movements. It might sound degrading today, but back then, this was one of the most powerful positions in the entire court. These men didn't just assist the king with his private affairs, they controlled access to him, and at times, even held the royal seal bearing the king's signature, a stamp powerful enough to shift the entire kingdom's direction. And when we say close to the king, we mean very close, especially in his later years. When Henry's body was no longer the athletic form of his youth, once a man with the physique of a Tudor CrossFit athlete, Henry began to grow rounder and rounder and rounder, to the point where he could no longer mount a horse without the help of a crane.
What is quite ironic is that when he first sends to the Pope to request his annulment, his messenger also has a second request.
Yes, you heard that right, a crane. A custom pulley system was installed to hoist the 400-pound monarch, with a 50-inch waistline, onto his warhorse. Some historians believe he even had to use an early form of wheelchair just to get around the palace. But it didn't stop there. After a brutal jousting accident in 1536, a wound on Henry's leg began to fester and never healed. It grew infected, ulcerated, exposing even the bone. The stench was said to carry through 3 entire rooms. Courtiers would mask the smell with handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar and perfume to avoid passing out in his presence. Now imagine being the groom of the stool in that situation. Still sound like an honor? Henry could no longer ride. He could no longer walk on his own. He became increasingly irritable, paranoid, and mentally unstable. He wasn't just trapped inside his decaying body, he was trapped inside a mind unraveling from within. This once mighty ruler, the most powerful king in Europe, now had to be wiped, lifted, moved, and preserved with herbs, perfumes, and brute force. And yet, despite the rot, the pain, the dependency, he was still called Your Majesty. Of all the people who had to endure the king's bodily stench, Anne Boleyn probably deserves a gold medal for patience. But her patience would earn her nothing more than a death sentence. After growing weary of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, whose crime was failing to produce a male heir, Henry decided to do something no English monarch had ever dared before. He broke with the Pope and established the Church of England all so he could marry his mistress, Anne. Yes, you heard that right. He created an entire religion because of a crush, once called Defender of the Faith by the Pope. Henry promoted himself to founder of a new faith for personal convenience, and did it all with a straight face. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had scandalized all of Europe with their forbidden romance, finally became Queen of England with just one condition: give the king a son. And here's where the tragedy begins. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Yes, the Elizabeth I. Though at the time, nobody really cared. What followed were miscarriages, stillbirths, and a king who was quickly running out of patience. The once dazzling and sharp Anne had become little more than a disappointment, and so, much like tossing a used napkin into the fire, the king decided this must end, and freeze. But in true Tudor fashion, he didn't settle for divorce, not this time. He upped the stakes with a full-blown show trial. Anne was accused of everything: adultery, incest, treason. They even fabricated evidence that she had slept with her own brother, a charge so revolting it could only have been invented by men desperate to give legal cover to a pre-planned execution. Charges? Secured? Proof? Optional. The scaffold was already waiting. On May 19, 1536, just 3 years after becoming queen, Anne Boleyn was beheaded at the Tower of London. In front of a crowd, equal parts horrified and fascinated. And Henry? Just 1 day after Anne lost her head, he became engaged to Jane Seymour, as casually as if he were swapping out a SIM card. Some accounts claim he even hosted a celebration while Anne's blood was still drying. And the great irony, after all that, it was Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, the one Henry never wanted, who would become his greatest successor. While Henry VIII is remembered as the man who founded a religion to marry a woman, only to behead her like a criminal. God may have given him the crown, but Henry used it to pen a love story written in blood. After ending his religiously disruptive love affair with one clean slice of the executioner's blade, Henry VIII quickly returned to the great obsession of his life, having a male heir, and since his legitimate wives were still failing to produce results, the king figured, why not use the beta version? That beta version was Henry Fitzroy, the illegitimate son he had with his mistress, Elizabeth Bessie Blount, one of the few women who managed to please the king without ending up at the execution block. Henry Fitzroy, a name that practically oozes nobility, literally means son of the king in medieval terms. And in true unmatched Tudor fashion, Henry VIII elevated his bastard son to Duke of Richmond and Somerset, showered him with lands, titles, and, naturally, cooked up a plan that would leave even the Pope scratching his head. The plan? Marry his legitimate daughter, Princess Mary, to his illegitimate son. Yes, you heard that right. A wedding between half-siblings. Why? Because when you're desperate, the boundaries of morality, genetics, and theology tend to Blur. And here's the kicker. The Pope said yes. Whether he was pressured or simply confused, we'll never know. But for a brief moment in history, this royal sibling wedding special almost became a reality. Thankfully, for humanity, and for Princess Mary, fate intervened. Fitzroy died young, at the age of 17, before he could marry, become king, or start a line of scandalous semi-royal offspring. Some say it was tuberculosis. Others suspect he simply collapsed under the crushing weight of his father's expectations. Regardless, his death was a massive blow to Henry's succession plans. And for Mary, it was a golden escape ticket from a marriage that even the Roman gods would have found disturbing. In the end, when Henry couldn't get a legitimate heir, he tried to repurpose whatever he had on hand: bending lineage, ethics, and theology like overcooked spaghetti. But like any terrible recipe, this one was simply inedible.
Lady Jane Seymour.
Lady Jane? Your Majesty, are you saying that I should be queen instead of her?
After the devastating loss of Fitzroy, the malfunctioning beta version of an heir, Henry VIII returned to the traditional method. Find a new wife, but this time, he wanted less drama, fewer headlines, and a higher chance of producing a male heir. Enter Jane Seymour, stepping into the Tudor cinematic universe as what seemed like a side character. Yet she became the one to score the golden goal. She wasn't as alluring as Anne Boleyn, nor as powerful as Catherine of Aragon. Jane was quiet, modest, and knew exactly when to speak, the perfect profile for a king who was utterly exhausted from years of royal drama and emotional turbulence. And she did the one thing her predecessors failed to do. She gave Henry a legitimate son. On the 12th of October, Jane gave birth to Edward VI, and the palace erupted in celebrations akin to a Tudor World Cup victory. Henry was so overjoyed, he nearly cancelled all future execution orders for upcoming wives. Finally, he had a son. Finally, the Tudor bloodline had its male heir. The only problem? Jane didn't live long enough to enjoy her own triumph. Just 12 days after giving birth, she died from postnatal complications, a tragic ending, but one that earned her the unusual honor of being the only one of Henry's wives buried beside him. Rather than beneath the executioner's blade or under the weight of scandal, some have joked, if you want to survive marriage to Henry VIII, your best bet is either never to marry him or die before he gets bored. Even frail, and sadly for Jane, she chose the second option. As for Edward VI, he was raised to be a king, a child destined to carry all of England's hopes on his tiny shoulders. But fate, never much of a Tudor fan, had other plans. Edward ruled for only 6 years and died at the age of 15, before he could marry or produce an heir, which meant that after all the divorces, beheadings, religious schisms, and the creation of an entire church, Henry's dream of a male succession ended with a soft, anticlimactic pop. A king who restructured the spiritual and legal foundation of a nation just to have one son, and that son never lived long enough to fulfill any of it. It's as if history itself leaned in, gave a cynical smirk, and whispered, "Was it worth it, Henry?" And if you thought Henry VIII was only a tyrant in matters of the heart, brace yourself, because to Henry, The concept of unfriending someone didn't involve clicking a button. It usually involved an axe, a public execution, and a farewell letter that might as well have read, "Thanks for the memories." See, one of the most nobly unfriended was none other than Sir Thomas More, a brilliant scholar, renowned writer, and a man who had likely shared pints and secrets with the king himself. More wasn't just any courtier. He was once the Lord Chancellor of England, a philosopher respected across Europe, and someone whom Henry truly admired, until he refused to acknowledge Henry as England's version of the Pope. Yes, you read that correctly. After breaking from the Catholic Church to marry Anne Boleyn, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, a rather innovative way to get both divorced and spiritually independent, without needing papal permission. But Thomas More didn't buy into the upgrade. He declined to subscribe to Henry's new theological package, refused to swear an oath recognizing the king's divine supremacy, and worse, did so quietly. He didn't write a rebuttal. He didn't protest in the streets. He just stayed silent. But to Henry, silence was passive rebellion, a kind of level 1 spiritual treason. And so, after a string of rigged trials and many not so subtle warnings along the lines of "just be smart," my friend, Henry ordered the execution of Sir Thomas More in 1535. In one of the most brutal unfriendings of all time, Henry proved a chilling truth: never disagree on theology with a man who has power, his own execution squad, and an ego bigger than the throne. On the scaffold, Thomas More famously said, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first," a line that was part loyal, part satirical, and heartbreakingly noble. A final mic drop from a man who lost his head simply for disagreeing with his best friend. And so everything came full circle, a spiral of ambition, blood, and emptiness. Henry VIII, the man who broke away from the Catholic Church, who restructured the religious fabric of an entire kingdom just to produce a male heir, ultimately left behind one cruel twist of fate. Not a single direct descendant survived past the 16th century. Edward VI, the son Henry exchanged for the life of Jane Seymour. The only wife he seemingly mourned reigned for only 6 years. Crowned at age 9. He died at 15. Most likely of tuberculosis or Hodgkin's lymphoma. Historians still debate. A kid death. For a child burdened with impossible expectations, Mary, known to the world as Bloody Mary, for her fiery persecution of Protestants, married King Philip II of Spain, yet bore no children. Despite enduring at least 2 phantom pregnancies, pseudochasis, a rare psychological condition in which the body mimics all signs of pregnancy except the actual child. And then there was Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, who famously declared, "I am married to England." She ruled gloriously for 45 years. Never married. Had no children, and left no direct heir. 3 children, 3 reigns, 1 ending, finality. Modern genealogical research confirms that none of the current British royal family are biological descendants of Henry VIII. Instead, Queen Elizabeth II, often mistakenly believed to be his descendant, was actually a direct descendant of Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister. and a part-time lover of Henry himself. The children Mary bore during her marriage to William Carey, according to scholars like Philippa Gregory and research from the Boleyn Lineage Project, may have been Henry's illegitimate offspring. But official history, it refuses to acknowledge it. So, if you watched The Other Boleyn Girl and believed it as gospel, you're standing somewhere between Hollywood fantasy and historical speculation. In short, Henry VIII, the king who re-engineered the religious order of a nation to ensure a male legacy, ended up as a severed branch, fruitless, flowerless, and utterly alone on the great royal family tree. The irony is sharp. A man who used absolute power to rewrite history, but could not write the next chapter of his own bloodline. Instead of leaving a robust royal lineage, Henry left behind a collection of state papers, hundreds of dramatic portraits, syrupy love letters, bloody court records, and a religious rupture between England and Rome, a political legacy that still sparks debate today. He became the story of a man both majestic and tragic, the father of the English Renaissance, yet also a symbol of obsessive control, paranoia, and unchecked ego. And if you ever stumble upon a history meme showing a bloated king being hoisted onto a horse by a crane, chances are that's Henry. He lives on in pop culture, in plays, films, textbooks, and of course on Netflix, but memory, whether glorious or grotesque, cannot inherit the throne. A dynasty, no matter how grand, will always crumble if built more on the hunger for control than on love and wisdom. Henry VIII once changed laws, defied popes, and steered the destiny of an empire. But in the end, he could not defy the simplest truth of creation. That legacy isn't born of power alone, but of kindness, spirit, and the continuation of something truly beautiful. And so, it ends. The Tudors are no more. Henry, the magnificent majesty of his own myth, remains only a figure in dusty archives, curated galleries, and the curious hearts of those who love a tale both hilarious, horrifying, and hauntingly profound.